all the way to game 7 in the first round. So Harden struggled badly when it mattered most, scoring just 7 points on 2 of 8 shooting in the elimination game. And the Clippers went home once again without the deep run they had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to manufacture. When you add all of this up, the Clippers gave away SGA and a generation of draft picks they're still paying today, paid some of the largest luxury tax bills in NBA history, and the best they could produce with all of it was one bubble conference finals and a string of early exits. From LA, we head to Oklahoma City, because before the Thunder became the model franchise that the Clippers helped build with all of those picks, they had their own super team moment that lasted exactly 1 season and ended in complete embarrassment. Oklahoma City is one of the smallest markets in the NBA, and for most of their history as the Thunder, they punched well above their weight by drafting brilliantly and developing players the right way. From Kevin Durant to Russell Westbrook to James Harden, all drafted and built in OKC. And then Durant left for Golden State in 2016 and broke the city's heart in a way that still stings a decade later. Westbrook stayed, won the MVP averaging a triple-double for the entire season, and carried a 47-win team almost entirely on his back.
Westbrook, the crossover drive, and throws it down! There it is, that nuclear athleticism from Russell Westbrook.
It was one of the most remarkable individual seasons the sport had seen in years, and it deserved better than just a first-round exit against Houston. So the following summer, Sam Presti went to work. He pulled off a trade with the Indiana Pacers to bring in Paul George, and the price was surprisingly reasonable given what George was worth. By the way, off topic, have you guys noticed the repeat names that we've said in this video? Indiana had limited leverage because George had already told them that he planned to leave for the Lakers in free agency the following summer. So OKC was able to get him for Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis. No first-round picks were involved. It was widely considered one of the best value trades of that era. Then just a few weeks later, the Thunder added Carmelo Anthony, who had requested a trade out of New York and waived his trade kicker to make the deal work, coming over for a package of role players and a second-round pick. Suddenly, OKC had 3 former All-Stars, a reigning MVP, and a city that was buzzing again. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone watching closely. All 3 of them needed the ball. Westbrook was at his best when he had the freedom to attack, push pace, and make decisions in the open floor. George was prolific at shot creation off the dribble and needed touches and space to operate. And Carmelo Anthony, who had spent his entire career as a volume scoring isolation player, was being asked to reinvent himself as a floor spacer and third option at 33 years old. And they wanted him to come off the bench.
Hey, P, they said I gotta come off the bench.
He couldn't do it. He shot 35% from 3, which was respectable, but he looked disinterested defensively and most of the time offensively when he wouldn't get touches. He was a liability in stretches, especially for a team that needed contribution from their third star. Coach Billy Donovan spent the whole season trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have a clean solution. The trio never looked like a championship caliber unit. They finished 48-34, good enough for the 4th seed, and then drew the Utah Jazz in the first round. The Jazz had a 21-year-old rookie named Donovan Mitchell who had absolutely no fear of the moment.
Mitchell going right at Anthony. There it is. Hold on now. That's
and he averaged 28.5 points against OKC's vaunted defense across that series. The Thunder lost in 6 games, with Carmelo averaging under 12 points on 37% shooting, while Mitchell was putting on a show at the other end.
I don't know. I think we missed. I think we all missed.
The aftermath was merciless. Carmelo was traded to Atlanta that summer and immediately bought out. His career as a star-level player effectively finished from that point forward. Paul George, who everyone expected to leave for the Lakers, stunned the league by re-signing with OKC on a 4-year max deal in July of 2018. And then, 1 year later, he reverse-coursed immediately and demanded a trade to the Clippers, which set off a chain of events we already talked about in the last segment. Westbrook was eventually traded to Houston in the summer of 2019, ending an era in Oklahoma City that had promised so much and delivered 1 MVP season and a whole lot of heartbreak. It was a strange, messy conclusion to a franchise that had done everything right for a decade, and the one time they tried to shortcut the process the way everyone else was doing it, they found out pretty quickly why that process existed in the first place. Now, we're gonna take a step back in time, because the next story on this list is the oldest one we've got, and in a lot of ways, it might be the most poetic. Some people actually consider this Houston Rockets team to be one of the first super teams the NBA had ever seen. 3 legends, 3 Hall of Famers, all in the twilight of their careers, all chasing one last shot at a ring. Every franchise that came after them and tried to stack stars in some ways following a blueprint that this team helped write. It didn't end the way any of them had hoped, but the story of how it came together is worth every second. By 1996, the Houston Rockets had already won back-to-back championships in 94 and 95. With Hakeem the Dream as the best player on both of those teams, and Clyde Drexler arriving mid-season in '95 to push them over the top for the second title. Drexler and Hakeem had been college teammates at Houston, and watching them finally win a championship together was one of the feel-good stories of that decade. But the window was closing, the team was aging, and the front office knew that they needed one more piece if they were going to make another run before their time ran out. So in the summer of 1996, they made a phone call to Phoenix, and they traded for Charles Barkley. To get him, they gave up young Robert Horry, Sam Cassell, Chucky Brown, and Mark Bryant. At the time, it felt like a reasonable price to pay for one of the most dominant power forwards the game had ever seen. What nobody fully appreciated in that moment was what they were actually giving away. Cassell was a clutch, savvy point guard who went on to win 2 more championships after leaving Houston. And well, Robert Horry, as y'all know, became one of the most decorated role players in NBA history. He went on to win 5 more rings after that trade. 2 with the Lakers, 2 with the Spurs, and 1 he had already won in Houston before the trade. The man they traded away for Barkley won 5 more championships, man. Let that sink in for a second. But I gotta say, the vision made some sense on paper. Hakeem was 33, Drexler was 34, Barkley was 33, and all 3 of them were still capable of playing at an extremely high level. The 96-97 Rockets went 57-25, one of the best records in the league, and they looked like a real threat to dethrone the Utah Jazz and the Chicago Bulls as the class of the sport. They beat Minnesota in the first round, beat Seattle in a tough second round series, and then ran into Karl Malone and John Stockton in the Western Conference Finals. Utah was in the middle of their 2-year run as the best team in the West. Malone was the MVP that season, and the Jazz beat Houston in 6 games. The defining moment of that series came in Game 6, when Stockton hit a 3-pointer over Barkley to clinch it and send Utah to the NBA Finals. It was a brutal way to go out. The following season, the Rockets declined to 41-41. Drexler announced that he was retiring at the end of the season to take the head coaching job at the University of Houston, and they limped into the playoffs as the 8th seed before losing to Utah again in the first round. Clyde the Glide retired. Barkley played 2 more years in Houston before rupturing his quads in 1999 and retiring himself. And of course, Hakeem was eventually traded to the Toronto Raptors in 2001 for one final season before calling it a career. The legacy of this trio is a complicated one. 3 of the 50 greatest players in NBA history, all on the same team, and they never made it back to the finals together. But there's something almost noble about the way it ended. Three legends who had given everything to the game trying one last time to reach the mountaintop, falling just short and walking away with their heads held high. Every super team came after them. Every front office that called a rival and said, let's make a deal, was chasing some version of what this Rockets team represented. The difference is that most of those teams didn't have the grace to fail the way Houston did. Now, I know everybody who's watching this video was waiting for this one, so let's shift back to Los Angeles. This time around, though, the cast of characters is very different. The era is different, and somehow the result is even harder to watch than the last one. By 2020, the Los Angeles Lakers were back on top of the basketball world. LeBron James and Anthony Davis had just won the NBA championship in the bubble, delivering the franchise its first title in a decade and reminding everyone that when those two were healthy and locked in, they were one of the most dominant duos the sport had to offer. The following season, they lost in the first round to the Phoenix Suns, with both LeBron and Davis dealing with injuries that compromised the whole team down the stretch. It was a disappointing exit, but the core was still intact, and the expectation was that they would bounce back and compete again the next year. Oh boy, but what happened next is one of the most baffling roster decisions of the modern era. In August of 2021, the Lakers traded for Russell Westbrook. They sent Kyle Kuzma, Montrezl Harrell, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and a first-round pick to Washington to bring in a player who had built his entire legacy on being Mr. Triple-Double, one of the most statistically overwhelming guards the game had ever produced. On the surface, it looked like the move that would push LA back into title contention. In reality, though, it was one of the worst fits in NBA history.
What I'm disappointed with Westbrook is I thought he was going to come with all this energy, get the rebound, go coast to coast. We haven't seen a lot of that.
Let's just be real here. The problem was fundamental, and it was visible from the very first week of the NBA season. LeBron James, even at 37, needed the ball in his hands to operate effectively. Anthony Davis needed space in the paint and clean pick and rolls to dominate. And Russell Westbrook, whose entire game was built around attacking the rim with the ball, pushing pace in transition, and making decisions at full speed, needed the ball too. When you have three players on one team that need the ball, it's not going to work out. We've seen this time and time again. They even managed to bring in Carmelo Anthony midway through the season. The same Carmelo who had just been through his own failed super team experience in Oklahoma City, hoping that he could provide some veteran scoring off the bench. Westbrook wasn't a shooter. He shot just 29% from three that season, which meant the floor space the Lakers desperately needed from their point guard was never there. Every time Westbrook touched the ball in a half-court set, the offense ground to a halt, and the frustration on both sides was impossible to hide. Head coach Frank Vogel spent the entire season trying to solve a problem that had no clean solution, rotating Westbrook in and out of lineups, experimenting with different closing units, and reportedly dealing with an increasingly fractured locker room dynamic. The Lakers finished 33-49, missing the play-in tournament entirely, which is the first time LeBron James had missed the postseason since his second year in the league back in 2005. For a franchise that had just won a championship 2 years earlier, it was a disappointing collapse. And I'm sure you guys remember it like it was yesterday. Westbrook was catching all of the blame.
And he shoots it so high up, he hits the tip top of the backboard. And again, demoralized.
Where you know, my name is getting shamed, it becomes a issue.
The aftermath got messy in a hurry. Head coach Vogel was fired. Darvin Ham was brought in as the new head coach. Westbrook opted into his $47 million player option for the following season and was moved to the bench, where he actually played a more positive role as a sixth man. But the damage to the roster's identity had already been done. The Lakers eventually moved him in February of 2023 in a three-team deal that brought back D'Angelo Russell, Malik Beasley, and Jared Vanderbilt. And almost immediately, that team looked like a different unit. They went on a run that carried them all the way to the Western Conference Finals that same season, which in a strange way made the whole Westbrook era even more frustrating to look back on, because the talent was clearly there, it just needed the right pieces around it. They ended up getting swept in the conference finals by the Denver Nuggets, but still, he got the brunt of the blame. The Westbrook experiment costed the Lakers a first-round pick, a season of LeBron's prime at 37, which is crazy to say, and 2 years of organizational dysfunction that set the franchise back in ways that are still being untangled. It stands as the clearest example of what happens when front offices prioritize star power and name recognition over fit, over the basic basketball question of how do these players actually work together on the floor. And that's what this video has been about. The answer in this case was that they didn't, and everybody saw it coming except the people who made the deal. And the Lakers weren't the only team that learned that lesson the hard way during this era. Because over in New York, Madison Square Garden was hosting its own version of this exact same story. New York City is the biggest stage in basketball, even though they haven't won anything since 1973, but shout out that NBA Cup though, right? Anyways, for the Knicks fans who spent the better part of 2 decades watching their franchise stumble through bad trades, worse contracts, and one embarrassing offseason after another, the early 2010s felt like something was finally changing. And it started with Amar'e Stoudemire, who signed a 5-year, nearly $100 million deal in the summer of 2010 and immediately brought life back to Madison Square Garden. He was explosive, he was dynamic, and he gave the city something it hadn't had in years. But everyone watching knew Amar'e alone wasn't enough. The Knicks needed a star, and in February of 2011, they went and got one. They traded everything for Carmelo Anthony. And the price was steep. Denver got Wilson Chandler, Raymond Felton, Danilo Gallinari, Timofey Mozgov, a first-round pick, and cash, all for one guy who said he was joining the Knicks in free agency that following summer, which limited the Knicks' leverage in the negotiation. And Denver milked every last drop of it. But at the time, the city didn't care about the cost. Carmelo Anthony was a Knick. Madison Square Garden was electric again. And for the first time in a long time, the Knicks felt relevant.
Anthony for 3. Bang! That one goes down, and the game is tied. Anthony for 3. Puts it in! Knicks by 1 with 8.2 remaining.
Then in December of 2011, they ended up adding Tyson Chandler, who had just won a championship with the Dallas Mavericks and was coming off one of the best defensive seasons any center had produced in years. He won Defensive Player of the Year that season with the Knicks, brought toughness and edge to a roster that had always been soft at the center position. And suddenly, New York had something that looked like a real big three. Carmelo scoring from everywhere, Amar'e as the athletic big man who could play in space, and Chandler anchoring the defense and cleaning up the glass. The best version of this team showed up in the 2012-2013 season. They went 54-28, their best record in almost 2 decades, won the Atlantic Division for the first time since 1994, and Carmelo Anthony led the entire league in scoring at 28.7 points per game. The Garden was as loud as it had been since the Patrick Ewing era. Knicks fans were genuinely dreaming about a deep playoff run. They beat the Boston Celtics in the first round, and their first playoff series win since the year 2000. Then they ran into the Indiana Pacers in the second round, and that dream died fast. The Pacers were physical and suffocating defensively, with Roy Hibbert protecting the paint in a way that neutralized everything the Knicks wanted to do inside. New York ended up losing in 6 games, and it wasn't particularly close by the end. That series exposed everything that was fragile about this roster. Amar'e's knees had been broken since before the season started, quietly taking away the athleticism that made him so dangerous. Melo's constant ISO play, which worked well in the regular season, kept running into brick walls against a defense built specifically to contain a player like him.
Anthony attacks. Hibbert denies him at the rim.
And unfortunately for them, the following season it all unraveled. They fell to 37-45, and the Big Three era in New York was over just as quickly as it began. Tyson Chandler was traded back to Dallas. Amar'e's contract became one of the most painful albatrosses in the league as his knees gave out completely and played just 47 games over his final 2 seasons with the team. Carmelo signed a 5-year max extension and oversaw 5 straight losing seasons before the Knicks finally moved on from him in 2017. Phil Jackson came in as GM, tried to convince them to run the triangle, feuded with Carmelo publicly, and made everything so much worse. It was a full organizational collapse that took years to dig out from. The cruelest part of the whole story is how close it felt in that 2013 season. 54 wins, the best record the franchise had seen in a generation, and they still couldn't get out of the second round. For a city that bleeds basketball the way New York does, that kind of almost is sometimes harder to swallow than never getting there at all. And we saved the last story for a team that didn't just fail to get out of the second round. They failed to win a single playoff game. Nearly $630 million spent, 2 head coaches fired, and not one playoff series victory to show for any of it. It's time to talk about the Phoenix Suns, a franchise that had already been to the finals as recently as 2021 with Devin Booker leading the way. They decided in the winter of 2023 that they were done being close and ready to win right now. And when your owner says that, you should probably run in the opposite direction. New owner Matt Ishbia had just taken over that franchise from Robert Sarver. He had deep pockets and even deeper ambition. And the first thing he did was authorize one of the most aggressive roster overhauls the league had ever seen. It started with none other than Kevin Durant. yet. Brooklyn was in full meltdown mode after February of 2023. KD had already requested a trade the previous summer, and Phoenix swooped in and gave the Nets everything they asked for. Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Jay Crowder, 4 unprotected first-round picks, and a pick swap. Mikal Bridges was one of the most beloved players in Phoenix, a homegrown fan favorite who had been a part of that 2021 finals run, and they shipped him out overnight for a 34-year-old Durant who had spent the last 3 years watching his Brooklyn super team implode.
Yeah, I mean, it's KD. I get it. Like, I 100% get it. That's just how it is. Like,
the city was shocked, but the excitement was undeniable. Then a few months later, they decided to go out and get Bradley Beal from Washington. Beal came with a 5-year, $251 million max contract and the only no-trade clause in the entire NBA. What he also came with, though nobody wanted to say it loudly at the time, was a history of injuries that had limited his availability for years and a skill set that overlapped heavily with both Durant and Booker. 3 guys, all of whom needed the ball. All of whom were at their best creating off the dribble in isolation situations. Where have we heard that before, huh? The spacing concerns were real and they were obvious, but Phoenix was swinging for the fences and nobody was going to pump the brakes now. The financial commitment alone was staggering. Over the 2 seasons this trio played together, the Suns spent nearly $630 million in combined salary and luxury tax. $630 million. That's more than some NBA franchises have spent in their entire existence. They hired Frank Vogel as head coach, the same Frank Vogel the Lakers had just fired after the Westbrook disaster. And when that didn't work, they went and hired Mike Budenholzer, 2 championship-winning coaches, back-to-back, and neither one of them could make this roster function. The on-court product was just as painful to watch. Beal struggled to find his footing as a third option. The spacing was as problematic as everyone feared, and injuries ravaged the roster in the worst possible moments. Durant was still capable of brilliance and stretches, but couldn't drag a broken system to the finish line by himself. Booker, to his credit, kept competing, kept showing up, and kept shouldering the burden of a situation that was deteriorating around him. In the 2024 playoffs, they drew the Minnesota Timberwolves in the first round and got swept 4-0. The following season was even worse. They couldn't even make it out of the play-in tournament, finishing 11th in the West at 36-46. Durant left in the final stretch of the season with an ankle injury and didn't come back. Budenholzer was fired, and just like that, the most expensive big 3 in NBA history was done. Having won, let's see, exactly 0 playoff series together. Durant was eventually traded to Houston in a massive 7-team deal that summer. Beal was bought out and signed with the Clippers. Booker re-signed and is still in Phoenix, trying to rebuild something from all of that wreckage. The last man standing from an era that cost the franchise its future and delivered nothing in return. But hey, at least they sell $2 hot dogs in the arena, right? And that right there is the story of the Big 3 era in the NBA. 10 rosters, hundreds of millions of dollars, locker room drama, coaching changes, and player demands. From Kobe's torn Achilles to Kyrie's personal situation. From the picks that became Tatum and Brown to the money Phoenix flushed into a trio that never figured it out. The pattern is always the same. And the brutal reality that talent alone has never been enough. The teams that actually won, the ones with the banners hanging up in the rafters, they had the right fit, they had patience, and they had the players who were willing to sacrifice something for the guy next to them. That sounds simple. In the NBA, it is anything but. 10 teams that believed, 10 cities that dreamed, and 10 rosters that reminded the entire league that in this sport, putting great players together is the easy part. Making it work is a completely different story.